Northern Minnesota, late October 1887. The most respected master builder in Coochin County stood in front of a half-finished cabin and shook his head. "This," he said loud enough for the gathered men to hear, "is the most dangerous waste of timber I've seen in 30 years." What he was looking at didn't look like much. Stone, moss, birch bark layered in ways that made no sense to American eyes. A chimney positioned in the corner instead of the center. Walls that seemed twice as thick as they needed to be. The man building it, a quiet Norwegian immigrant named Viggo Arnesen, said nothing. He just kept working. By Christmas, that dangerous waste would force every builder in the region to question everything they knew about keeping warm. Today, you're going to understand why the worst idea in Minnesota became the most copied, and why modern insulation still can't match what Viggo built with stone, moss, and physics. If you want to learn one real survival technique every week that actually worked when lives depended on it, hit subscribe right now. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what worked in Minnesota might save you next winter. Viggo Arnesen wasn't trying to prove anything. He was trying not to freeze. He'd arrived in Coochin County in the spring of 1886 with his wife Sigrid and their 2 daughters. The land office sold him 80 acres of white pine forest for almost nothing because nobody wanted it. Too far north. Too cold. The locals said only a fool would try to winter there. Viggo had survived Norwegian winters above the Arctic Circle. He wasn't worried about Minnesota, but he was worried about wood. The American method burned through timber like it was endless. Open fireplaces. Central chimneys that radiated half their heat straight through the roof. Thin log walls with gaps you could see daylight through. Every cabin he visited consumed cords of wood per week, and still, the families huddled near the fire while frost built up on the inside walls. "You get used to it," one neighbor told him. "That's just winter." Viggo didn't want to get used to it. Back home, in Nordland, his family's cabin stayed warm all night on a single firing. The secret wasn't burning more wood. It was keeping the heat. Stone stored it. Thick walls slowed its escape. The chimney didn't steal it. He sketched it out for a local carpenter, a man named Edmund Corte, who'd built half the cabins in the township. Corte looked at the drawing and laughed. "That's not how we build here. Your walls are twice as thick as they need to be. That corner chimney will smoke you out. And nobody builds with sod and moss anymore." This is 1887, not the Middle Ages. But Viggo had done the math. He knew how much would a family of 4 could realistically cut, split, and stack before snowfall. He knew how cold it got when the January wind came down from Canada. And he knew the American method would leave his family burning furniture by February. So he built it his way. Double wall construction. 18 inches thick. The outer wall, white pine logs, chinked tight. A 6-inch gap filled with dry sphagnum moss, compact, dense, still springy. Then an inner wall of split pine planks. The moss wouldn't settle, wouldn't rot, and it trapped air better than anything else in the forest. The chimney went in the northwest corner, the coldest side of the cabin, not to vent heat, to use it. He built the firebox with local sandstone, dense and heavy, and ran the chimney flue in a slow zigzag through a stone column that stretched floor to ceiling. Every bend forced the smoke to surrender its heat to the stone before escaping. The column would radiate warmth for hours after the fire died. Above it all, he layered birch bark under the sod roof, waterproof, flexible, and an insulator the locals had forgotten. Then 12 inches of soil and root-bound prairie grass. From the outside, it looked like a hillside with a door. From the inside, it was a battery, a thermal vault, a heat trap. The neighbors walked past and muttered. Corte told people it would collapse under the first snow. Another man, a merchant named Halvorsen who sold iron stoves, said it was immigrant superstition and that Viggo would be buying a cast iron stove by December. Viggo just kept stacking stone. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand without seeing it work, was that every choice had a reason. The corner placement wasn't arbitrary. In Nordland, where winter winds came from the northwest with brutal consistency, builders had learned over centuries to turn their weakest point into their strongest asset. The corner chimney didn't just heat, it defended. It created a thermal barrier exactly where cold attacked hardest. The moss wasn't a primitive material. It was superior to anything available at the lumberyard. Sphagnum moss, when dried and compressed, had an R value close to modern fiberglass. It didn't settle like sawdust. It didn't attract vermin like straw. It was naturally antimicrobial. It had been used to dress wounds in field hospitals for exactly that reason. And it was free, growing in every bog within walking distance. Vigo had also calculated the firebox size with precision. American fireplaces were huge, meant to burn large logs and produce immediate, visible heat. But they were terribly inefficient. Most of the heat went straight up the chimney. Vigo's firebox was smaller, deeper, and lined with dense sandstone that he'd selected personally from a riverbed 3 miles south. Sandstone held heat longer than granite, longer than limestone, longer than brick. He'd fire hard for 2 hours in the evening, let the stone absorb everything, then let it die. The stone would radiate warmth until morning. One firing. All night. That was the goal. By mid-November, the cabin was finished. The walls were up, the chimney was drawing clean, and the roof had already sprouted a thin layer of frost-killed grass. It looked strange. It looked old. It looked like something a peasant would build. That was the problem. American builders in 1887 prided themselves on progress. Sawmills, milled lumber, standardized dimensions. A cabin was supposed to look like a cabin. 4 square walls, a steep roof, a stone chimney rising from the center ridgeline. You proved you weren't a savage by building something modern. Vigo's structure violated every rule. The walls were too thick. Edmond Corte calculated that Vigo had used nearly 40% more logs than a standard build. That's 40% more labor, 40% more cost. For what? So it looks like a dirt mound. The moss insulation made people nervous. Moss holds water, Corte argued. You're building a rot box. Give it 2 years, and those inner walls will be black with mold. Vigo had accounted for this. The moss wasn't packed wet. It was harvested dry, in late summer, and compressed in thin layers with air gaps between. The birch bark vapor barrier kept interior moisture from reaching it. And because the wall was so thick, the temperature gradient was slow, no condensation point, no rot. But Corte wasn't interested in physics. He was interested in reputation. And this cabin made him look old-fashioned by proximity. The corner chimney was even worse. Heat rises center, Corte insisted. You put the chimney in the middle so the warmth spreads, even. Shove it in the corner, and half your house stays cold. Vigo tried to explain. The corner wasn't a design flaw. It was the whole point. The thermal mass column wasn't just venting smoke. It was a radiant heater positioned exactly where the cabin lost the most warmth. The thick stone absorbed heat on every firing and released it slowly, evenly, for up to 14 hours after the fire went out. The corner placement meant the heat radiated diagonally across the entire floor plan. Center chimneys wasted heat straight up. Corner chimneys worked, but explanations didn't matter. What mattered was that it looked wrong. The roof design drew particular scorn. 12 inches of sod seemed excessive, even dangerous. That's 800 pounds per square foot when it's snow-soaked, Corte told anyone who'd listen. The frame will buckle by February. But Vigo had built the roof structure from double beams, spaced tight, because he knew exactly how much load it would carry. The sod wasn't just insulation, it was thermal ballast. In summer, it would keep the cabin cool. In winter, it would hold heat like a blanket. The grass roots would knit together, creating a living, waterproof membrane that would last decades with minimal maintenance. And beneath it all, the birch bark layer, harvested in spring when the sap was running, peeled in long sheets, overlapped like shingles. Birch bark didn't rot. It didn't leak. The Vikings had used it for ships. The Sami used it for everything from containers to roofing to baby carriers. It was one of nature's perfect materials, and the Americans had completely forgotten about it in their rush toward tar paper and tin. Vigo had even thought about ventilation, another concern Corte raised. The cabin had small, adjustable vents near the roofline on the east and south walls. In deep winter, they'd stay closed. In spring, they'd open to release moisture. The system was passive, simple, and foolproof. But because it wasn't a modern sash window, people assumed it was backward. The final insult came from the township's self-appointed fire warden, a former carpenter named Dietrich Moore. He visited the site in late November and declared the whole structure a fire hazard waiting to happen. His reasoning: you've got wood, bark, and dried moss packed together. One spark, and it's a funeral pyre. Vigo pointed out that the firebox was fully enclosed in stone. The chimney was double-layered with clay mortar, and the bark was buried under a foot of wet soil. Moore just shook his head. I've been in this business 40 years, son. I know a risk when I see one. A visiting minister stopped by in late November and asked, politely, whether Vigo had consulted local knowledge before building. The implication was clear: immigrants should learn how things are done here. A trapper named Callum Shaw was less polite. He saw the sod roof and said, loud enough for others to hear, I've seen Sioux earth lodges sturdier than that. You sure you didn't forget you're a white man, Arneson? Vigo didn't respond, but Sigrid, overhearing from the doorway, went inside and shut the door a little harder than necessary. The technical mockery had become social. The breaking point came in early December at the township meeting. Coochin County was still organizing itself. Roads, bridges, school districts. The men gathered monthly in the largest cabin, which belonged to a banker named Oswald Penner. Vigo didn't usually attend. He had work, but Sigrid insisted he go. People were talking. She was right. Halfway through the meeting, Edmund Corte stood up. I want to raise a concern, he said. We've got a structure going up on the Arneson claim that I believe is unsafe. The room went quiet. Corte continued. The chimney's built wrong. Corner placement. No central draft. I've seen setups like that backdraft and fill a cabin with smoke in under an hour. If that happens in January, that family's dead. Vigo opened his mouth, but Corte wasn't finished. The walls are overbuilt and underventilated. Moss insulation traps moisture. I'm telling you, by spring thaw, that cabin's going to be a mold farm. And if it's not mold, it's fire. Birch bark under a sod roof. One chimney spark, and the whole thing goes up. Oswald Penner, who ran the meeting, looked uncomfortable. Vigo, you want to respond? Vigo stood. His English was clear but accented. The chimney draws clean. I've fired it 20 times. No smoke, no backdraft. The stone mass holds heat overnight. The moss is dry, no mold, no rot. The birch bark is wet-laid and covered. It will not burn. Corte shook his head. You fired it in autumn. Wait until it's 10 below and the wind's coming sideways. That draft will reverse, and you'll suffocate in your sleep. A few men nodded. One muttered agreement. Another man, a logger named Petter Gronberg, himself Norwegian but 3 years in America, stood up. Corte's right. I've seen cabins like this back in the old country. They're fine if you're a goat herd in the mountains. But here, we have sawmills. We have real materials. You don't need to build like a peasant. That word again. Peasant. Vigo felt it like a slap. But he kept his voice even. In Nordland, we heat all winter on 1/3 the wood you use here. The stone holds heat. The thick walls hold heat. That is not old. It is smarter. Corte's face went red. Smarter? You think you're smarter than men who've been building in this climate for 20 years? I think, Vigo said carefully, that burning 4 cord a month to stay barely warm is not smart. It is wasteful. The room erupted. Some men laughed. Others muttered insults. Penner banged his hand on the table for order. Callum Shaw, the trapper, leaned back and smirked. Tell you what, Arneson, you make it through January without buying a stove from Halvorsen. I'll admit you know what you're doing. But when your wife's begging for real heat, don't say we didn't warn you. Halvorsen, the stove merchant, grinned. He'd probably sell 3 units that winter. Maybe 4 if Vigo cracked. Vigo said nothing. He sat down. The meeting moved on. But outside, walking home in the dark, Sigrid took his arm. They'll see, she said quietly. Vigo nodded. They would. What stung most wasn't the technical criticism. Vigo could answer that with math and physics. It was the contempt beneath it. The assumption that because something was old, it was inferior. That because it came from another place, it couldn't work here. That innovation only flowed one direction, from America outward, never the reverse. Edmund Corte had built cabins his entire adult life. He was good at it, but he never questioned why he built them that way. He'd learned from his father, who'd learned from his father, who'd probably learned from a Pennsylvania Dutchman in the 1780s. The design had ossified into tradition. And tradition, in Corte's mind, equaled correctness. Vigo had questioned everything. He'd lived in a place where fuel was scarce and winter was 6 months long. Norwegian builders didn't have the luxury of waste. They'd spent generations iterating, testing, refining. What Corte called peasant construction was actually applied thermodynamics, learned not in universities but through survival, failure, and hard-won success. The social dimension was worse. By building differently, Vigo had inadvertently challenged the community's identity. Coochin County was American frontier, rough, practical, forward-looking. To build like a Norwegian was to reject that identity, to suggest that the American way wasn't the best way. People took it personally. Callum Shaw's comment about the Sioux Earth Lodges wasn't just mockery. It was a threat. It implied that Vigo was regressing, going native, abandoning civilization. In a place where settlers were still defining themselves against the wilderness and its previous inhabitants, that was a serious accusation. Even Petter Gronberg's betrayal made sense in that context. He was Norwegian, yes, but he was also American now. He'd been here longer. He'd assimilated. He'd learned to build the American way, and he'd earned respect for it. Vigo's cabin was a reminder of what Petter had left behind, and he didn't want to be associated with it. The cold came early. December 18th, 1887. The temperature dropped to 12 below zero overnight, 15 degrees colder than normal for mid-December. Then it kept dropping. By December 21st, it was negative 22. On Christmas Eve, the thermometer outside the township hall read negative 31 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind never stopped. It came down from Canada in waves, knifing through gaps in cabin walls, turning fireplaces into wind tunnels, sucking heat out through every poorly chinked seam. Families woke to frost on their inside walls. Water buckets froze solid by the hearth. And the wood consumption became unsustainable. Edmund Corte burned through a half-cord in 3 days. He and his sons were splitting frozen logs by lantern light, feeding the fire every 2 hours just to keep the temperature above freezing. They slept in shifts. Callum Shaw's cabin developed a backdraft problem. Smoke filled the room every time the wind shifted. He stuffed rags in the gaps, but that made the draft worse. By the 26th, his family had moved in with neighbors. Oswald Penner's chimney cracked. Thermal shock, rapid heating and cooling. A split ran from the firebox to the roofline. He kept firing it anyway, praying it wouldn't collapse, because the alternative was worse. Halvorsen, the stove merchant, ran out of inventory. He sent an emergency order to Duluth, but the roads were impassable. Nobody was getting resupplied until the thaw. Petter Gronberg, the Norwegian who'd called Vigo a peasant, was burning furniture. And the whole time, Vigo's cabin sat silent. No frantic wood splitting. No smoke pouring from the chimney at all hours. Just a thin trail in the mornings and evenings, barely visible. People noticed. On December 28th, Edmund Corte walked past Vigo's claim on his way to check a trapline. He'd been up since 4 a.m. feeding his fire. His hands were raw. His back ached. He was burning wood faster than he could replace it. And Vigo's cabin looked calm. Corte slowed. He could see Vigo outside, not splitting wood, but repairing a fence. No urgency. No panic. Corte's chest tightened. He kept walking. That night, he asked his wife, "How much wood do you think Arnesen's burning?" She looked at him. "Why?" "Just curious." She shrugged. "Less than us, I'd wager." Corte didn't sleep well. By December 30th, desperation had set in across the township. Families were consolidating, moving in together to share firewood and body heat. The school closed because the building couldn't be kept warm enough for children to hold pencils. The township hall canceled its New Year's meeting because nobody wanted to make the trip. Wood prices spiked. What little seasoned timber remained was being hoarded or sold at triple the normal rate. Green wood, wet, heavy, barely burnable, was being split and thrown into fireboxes out of sheer necessity. It produced more smoke than heat, but it was better than nothing. And the cold kept coming. New Year's Eve brought the worst night yet. -37 degrees Fahrenheit. The kind of cold that made your lungs ache. That turned spit to ice before it hit the ground. That cracked trees with sounds like rifle shots. Edmund Cortez's wife, Marta, started coughing on January 2nd. A wet, deep cough that rattled in her chest. She tried to hide it, but by the third day, she couldn't get out of bed. The cabin was too cold. They were burning everything they could find, but the temperature inside never rose above 45 degrees. Frost coated the windows. The water bucket was solid ice. Cortez sent his eldest son to fetch the doctor. The doctor came, examined Marta, and said what everyone already knew. She needed warmth, rest, and dry air. Get her somewhere warm, he said, or this turns into pneumonia. But there was nowhere warm, not in the entire township, except one place. Stay with me, because the result humiliated the correct method. Hit that like button if you want to see the numbers that made the whole county go silent. On January 4th, 1888, Edmund Cortez swallowed his pride and knocked on Vigo Arnezen's door. It was just after dawn. The thermometer read -29. Cortez's breath came in frozen clouds. His face was raw from windburn, his eyes red-rimmed from smoke and sleeplessness. Behind him, wrapped in every blanket they owned, were Marta and their youngest daughter. Vigo opened the door. Warmth poured out, actual physical warmth that Cortez could feel on his face from 6 feet away. My wife is sick, Cortez said. His voice cracked. The doctor said she needs warmth. I have nowhere else. Vigo stepped aside without a word. Come in. Cortez crossed the threshold and stopped. The difference was immediate. Not just warm, comfortable. The kind of warmth that sank into your bones and loosened the permanent clench in your shoulders. He looked around, disoriented. The fire in the corner firebox had burned down to coals. Just coals. No roaring flame. No frantic feeding of logs. And yet the cabin was, he guessed, at least 60 degrees. Maybe more. The stone column radiated heat like a living thing. He put his hand near it. Warm. Steady. Consistent. His own cabin, with a fire actively burning, never got above 45. Sigrid appeared from the back room and immediately took charge of Marta, guiding her to a chair near the thermal mass, wrapping her in dry wool. The little girl, Cortez's daughter, stood staring at the walls, at the ceiling, at the warmth. Cortez couldn't stop looking at the firebox. When did you last add wood? Vigo glanced at the light through the window. Last night, maybe 9 o'clock. It was 6:30 in the morning. 9.5 hours. On coals. Cortez's fire required feeding every 90 minutes or it died completely. How? Cortez asked. The word came out barely a whisper. Vigo gestured to the stone column. Thermal mass. The stone absorbs heat during the burn. Then it gives it back. Slowly. All night. Cortez moved closer to the column, studying it. The sandstone was a soft gray tan, dense and fine-grained. He could feel the heat radiating from it in waves, not the sharp, aggressive heat of an open flame, but a deep, penetrating warmth that filled the entire room. How much does it weigh? Cortez asked. Vigo thought for a moment. The column? Maybe 4,000 pounds. Foundation to roof. For 1,000 pounds of sandstone. Heated to over 300 degrees during the burn, then releasing that energy over the course of 12 to 14 hours. It was a battery. A heat battery. Cortez had been building cabins for 30 years, and he'd never once considered this. The walls, Cortez said, running his hand along the interior planks. I don't feel any drafts. Moss, Vigo said simply. 6 inches. Compressed. It stops air movement. It also stops radiant heat loss. Keeps the warmth inside instead of bleeding through the logs. Cortez had called it a rot box. But the walls were bone dry. No condensation. No mold smell. Just solid, silent insulation doing exactly what Vigo said it would do. By mid-morning, Marta's coughing had eased. The warmth was opening her lungs, loosening the congestion. Sigrid made her tea with honey and kept her near the stone column. The little girl had fallen asleep on a bench, finally warm enough to relax. Corte sat at the table, unable to leave, unable to look away from what he was seeing. Vigo didn't gloat. He just went about his day, mending a harness, sharpening tools, checking the door seals. Calm, efficient, unbothered by the cold that was destroying everyone else. Around noon, Vigo added 3 logs to the firebox. Small splits, maybe 8 inches long. He arranged them carefully, let them catch, then adjusted the air intake to slow the burn. Within 20 minutes, the fire was roaring, but controlled. Vigo let it burn hard for about 90 minutes, then damped it down to coals again. That's it? Corte asked. That's your whole day? Vigo nodded. 1 firing in the morning, 1 in the evening. Sometimes just 1 if it's not too cold. Corte did the math in his head. 2 firings, maybe 12 logs total per day. He was burning 40. The efficiency wasn't just better. It was a different category entirely. Word spread fast. By January 6th, half the township knew that Edmund Corte, the man who'd called Vigo's design dangerous, was sheltering his family in the peasant cabin. And they knew why. People started coming by. Not to mock. To see. Callum Shaw showed up on January 8th. He didn't apologize for the Earth Lodge comment, but he did ask, quietly, if he could examine the chimney. Vigo let him. Shaw spent an hour studying the flue path, the stone joints, the firebox design. He left without saying much, but 3 days later, he started tearing out his own chimney. Oswald Penner, the banker, visited on January 10th with a notebook. He measured everything. Wall thickness, firebox dimensions, stone column height. He asked about costs, labor hours, material sources. I'm building an addition in the spring, he said. I want to do it right. Even Peter Gronberg came by, shamefaced and silent. He looked at the moss insulation, touched the stone column, felt the ambient warmth. I'm sorry, he finally said. I was wrong. Vigo just nodded. It's fine. By late January, the cold had finally broken. The temperature climbed back to an almost reasonable 10 degrees. Families returned to their cabins and began the work of recovery, splitting wood, repairing frost damage, thawing out their lives. But the conversation had changed. Edmund Corte, to his credit, didn't hide what had happened. At the February township meeting, he stood up and said, plainly, I was wrong about Vigo Arnesen's cabin. It's not dangerous. It's not wasteful. It's the most efficient structure in this county, and I've learned more from it than from 30 years of building the way I was taught. The room stayed quiet, respectful. Corte continued. I tracked my wood consumption this winter versus his. I burn an average of 38 logs per day to keep my cabin barely habitable. Vigo burned 12. My internal temperature ranged from 40 to 50 degrees. His stayed between 65 and 72. In the coldest week we've ever seen. He let that sink in. That's not luck. That's engineering. And we'd all be smarter if we paid attention. The measurements became public record. People compared notes. The numbers were undeniable. Vigo's cabin. Internal temperature maintained at 68 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit during the coldest week on record. Lows of minus 37 degrees Fahrenheit external. Wood consumption, 10 to 14 logs per day. Firings, 1 to 2 per day. Standard cabins, Corte, Shaw, Penner. Others' internal temperature ranged 38 to 52 degrees Fahrenheit during same week. Wood consumption, 35 to 45 logs per day. Firings, continuous, every 90 to 120 minutes, day and night. Temperature differential. Vigo's cabin stayed an average of 28 to 34 degrees warmer than standard builds in equivalent conditions. On the coldest nights, the gap was even wider, up to 42 degrees warmer than Callum Shaw's drafty structure. But the most shocking number was fuel efficiency. Vigo used 68 to 72% less wood than his neighbors. That wasn't a minor improvement. That was the difference between survival and catastrophe. That was the difference between cutting 4 cords in the fall versus cutting 12. Between spending winter evenings with your family versus spending them in the dark, splitting frozen logs by lantern light. The thermal mass alone was responsible for most of it. Corte measured the stone column temperature at various points throughout the day. 2 hours after a firing, the surface read 210 degrees Fahrenheit. 6 hours later, 165 degrees Fahrenheit. 12 hours later, still 118 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to radiate meaningful warmth. The stone gave back heat for up to 14 hours after the fire died. By contrast, coldest central chimney, standard masonry, no thermal mass design, cooled to near ambient within 3 hours of the fire going out. All that heat just vanished up the flue. The moss insulation also shocked people once they understood it. Vigo agreed to let a few builders examine a small section of the wall. They found the moss still dry, still springy, compressed to about 70% of its original volume, which was ideal. It created thousands of tiny air pockets that blocked convective heat transfer. When tested informally, using hand feel in comparison, the moss wall stayed warm to the touch on the interior side, even when the exterior logs were frozen solid. The temperature gradient was slow and controlled. Dietrich Moore, the fire warden who declared the cabin a hazard, visited in late January to inspect for fire damage or chimney problems. He found none. The birch bark layer was intact. The sod roof showed no signs of stress. The chimney drew clean and showed no creosote buildup because the slow, hot burns vaporized impurities instead of depositing them. Moore wrote in his inspection report, "Structure sound. No fire risk observed. Design unconventional but effective." That was as close to an apology as anyone would get. The shift in Coochin County didn't happen all at once. It happened cabin by cabin, conversation by conversation, as people who'd survived the winter of 1887 to 88 started planning for the next one. Callum Shaw was the first to rebuild. He tore out his failing central chimney in March and constructed a corner thermal mass column based on Vigo's design. He didn't copy it exactly. He used local limestone instead of sandstone, and he positioned the firebox slightly different to match his cabin's layout. But the principle was the same. Massive stone, corner placement, slow-release heat. He fired it for the first time in October 1888. By November, he was telling people it was the smartest thing I ever built. Oswald Penner went further. When he built his addition in the spring of 1888, he incorporated double-wall construction with moss insulation, a sod roof with birch bark underlayment, and a smaller, more efficient firebox. He documented everything: costs, labor hours, materials, sources. Then he published his notes in the county record, making the information freely available. "There's no reason," he wrote, "for anyone to suffer the way we did this winter. The knowledge exists. Use it." By the fall of 1888, 11 cabins in Coochin County had adopted some version of Vigo's design. By the winter of 1889 to 90, that number had grown to 23. The techniques spread unevenly. Some people just added moss insulation, others rebuilt their chimneys, a few went all in with complete reconstructions, but the direction was clear. The peasant methods were becoming standard. Edmund Corte, perhaps feeling the need to make amends, became Vigo's unlikely evangelist. He started incorporating thermal mass principles into every cabin he built. He taught his apprentices the physics of heat retention, something he'd never bothered to learn himself until Vigo showed him. And when clients asked why the new designs looked different, he told them the story. The whole story, including the part where he'd been catastrophically wrong. "I spent 30 years building the same cabin over and over," he said in an interview years later, preserved in a 1910 county history. "I thought I was experienced. Turns out I was just repeating the same mistakes." Vigo Arneson showed me that experience without thinking is just stubbornness with a resume. That quote became something of a local legend. Petter Gronberg, the Norwegian who'd called Vigo a peasant, became one of the most vocal advocates for traditional Scandinavian building techniques. He started sourcing birch bark from local suppliers, teaching people how to harvest and prepare it. He wrote a short guide, hand-copied and distributed, on sphagnum moss collection, drying, and installation. He never quite apologized publicly for his earlier comments, but his actions spoke clearly enough. The social consequences rippled outward in unexpected ways. The township's relationship with immigrant knowledge changed. People stopped assuming that new meant American and old meant inferior. When a Finnish family arrived in 1889 and started building a sauna with a loily stove, instead of mocking it, people asked questions. When a Swedish homesteader mentioned root cellars dug below the frost line, people took notes. The term peasant construction disappeared from local vocabulary. It was replaced by old country methods or traditional engineering, terms that carried respect instead of contempt. Vigo himself remained modest. He didn't seek credit or recognition. He just kept building, kept refining, kept teaching anyone who asked. When people thanked him, he'd shrug and say, "I just built what I knew. This is how we do it at home." But privately, with Sigrid, he admitted it felt good to be proven right. Not because of ego, but because it meant his family was safe, and now other families would be too. Sigrid smiled when he said that. "You weren't trying to prove anything," she reminded him. "You were trying not to freeze." "Yes," Vigo agreed. "But it's nice that both things happened." By the mid-1890s, the Arneson design, though Vigo never called it that, had become a recognized vernacular style in northern Minnesota. Builders as far south as Duluth were incorporating thermal mass chimneys. Moss insulation became a standard option. Sod roofs, once laughed at, were recommended in agricultural extension guides for their durability and insulation value. The techniques even influenced institutional buildings. When Coochin County built its first schoolhouse in 1892, the architect, a man from St. Paul who'd never met Vigo, specified a corner masonry heater based on immigrant designs from the northern townships. The school stayed warm all winter on a fraction of the fuel the old building had required. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The dangerous waste of timber had become the blueprint. But perhaps the most telling consequence came the winter of 1893 to 94, when another brutal cold snap hit the region. Not as severe as 1887 to 88, but bad enough. Temperatures dropped to -25 for a week straight. Wind howled, supplies ran low, and Coochin County barely noticed. The cabins built with thermal mass and proper insulation kept their families warm. Wood consumption stayed manageable. No one burned furniture. No one got sick from cold exposure. The doctor made his normal rounds, not emergency calls. It was unremarkable. Routine. Winter, handled with competence instead of crisis. That was Vigo's legacy. Not fame, not wealth, just the quiet, undramatic success of a community that had learned to live smarter. There's a pattern in history that repeats endlessly. Someone brings knowledge from elsewhere, knowledge that's been tested, refined, proven over generations. And the response is almost always the same: mockery, dismissal, contempt. That's not how we do things here. Vigo Arneson's cabin was called dangerous, wasteful, primitive, backward. It was dismissed by experts, mocked by neighbors, and treated as evidence of ignorance. Until winter proved otherwise. The wisdom he brought wasn't ancient in the sense of being outdated. It was ancient in the sense of being refined. Hundreds of years of Norwegian builders, facing fuel scarcity and brutal cold, had iterated their way to solutions that actually worked. They'd learned, through survival, failure, and hard-won success, how to store heat, slow its escape, and make every log count. The Americans in Coochin County had experience, but they'd never questioned their methods. They'd never had to. Wood was abundant, so inefficiency didn't matter until it did. Vigo questioned everything, not because he was smarter, but because he came from a place where you couldn't afford to waste, where survival meant understanding why things worked, not just copying what your father did. The measurements don't lie. 68 to 72 degrees inside versus 38 to 52. 12 logs versus 40. 14 hours of heat from a single firing versus 90 minutes. That's not magic. That's thermodynamics. That's thermal mass, insulation, controlled combustion, and radiant heat transfer. It's physics applied with precision. And it's a reminder that old doesn't mean obsolete. Sometimes it means already solved. Modern homes, with all their technology, still struggle with the problems Vigo solved in 1887. We pump heat in and watch it leak out. We burn fuel constantly instead of storing energy and releasing it slowly. We've traded efficiency for convenience and called it progress. Vigo's cabin stayed 65 degrees warmer than the modern standard construction homes of his era. Not because he had better materials, not because he had more money, but because he understood heat, respected scarcity, and built with intention. The question isn't whether his methods were primitive. The question is, what have we forgotten? Which part of this solution would you apply to your house today? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I want to hear what the winters are like where you live. And if this made you think differently about old methods, hit that subscribe button. Every week, we're uncovering one survival technique that actually worked when lives depended on it. See you in the next one. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.